I knew moving into a gated community meant rules, but I didn't expect threats against my disabled son to be one of them. The first time I met Karen Stokely, president of the Oak Hill Bluffs HOA, she was standing on my driveway with a clipboard like a mall cop on a power trip. She was in her late 50s, with a tight bun, pastel windbreaker, and that permanent look like she just smelled sour milk. "You can't leave that ramp out overnight," she snapped, pointing at the portable wheelchair ramp I just installed off the side of our porch. "It's a tripping hazard and violates aesthetic guidelines." I wiped my hands on my jeans and looked her dead in the eye. "My son uses that ramp to get inside. He's in a wheelchair. It's not coming down." She glanced past me into the house where my 10-year-old son, Theo, was playing with his Lego on the living room floor, his wheelchair parked beside him. "I'm sorry about your situation," she said, not sounding the least bit sorry, "but the HOA has rules. The ramp has to be removed when not in use, or you'll be fined." That was the start of it. "My name's Silas Warren. I'm a single dad, work maintenance for the local school district, and I don't take kindly to threats, especially not when they're aimed at my kid." At first I thought maybe it was just a misunderstanding. I emailed the HOA board, explained Theo's condition, even attached a doctor's note and ADA documentation. I got a one-sentence reply 3 days later. "Rules apply to all residents." The next day, we got our first fine, $200 for a non-compliant structure. I refused to pay. Instead, I printed out a copy of the ADA accessibility guidelines, highlighted the relevant sections, and mailed it back with their fine notice. I figured that would shut it down. But Karen wasn't done. A week later, I came home from work to find Theo crying on the porch. His wheelchair ramp had been folded up and shoved into the bushes. "What happened?" I asked, kneeling beside him. "She said it was junk," Theo muttered, wiping his eyes. "She pushed it?" "Who?" "The lady from last week." I felt my jaw tighten. I went straight to the HOA office the next morning, which was really just a converted garage next to the pool house. Karen was sitting behind a desk, sipping from a mug that said Queen Bee. "You touched my son's ramp," I growled. She didn't even blink. "It was in violation. He needs it to get in the house. And he can get in just fine when you're home, can't he?" "There's no need to leave it out when you're not supervising. It's an eyesore." "Touch it again," I said, stepping closer, "and I'll have your job." Karen stood up, still holding that stupid mug. "It's not a job, Mr. Warren. It's a duty. I was elected. And if you continue to defy HOA regulations, we'll escalate enforcement. Consider this your final warning." "You threatened a disabled child," I said. "That's not enforcement, that's a lawsuit." She actually laughed. "You think the board cares about your little sob story? You're not special because your son's in a chair. If that ramp's not gone by the end of the week, I'll have it removed permanently." I left before I said something I'd regret, but I wasn't done. I installed a motion-activated camera on our porch that night. The next morning, I went to the city zoning office and asked for any records of HOA code enforcement rights. And then I called someone I hadn't spoken to in years, my cousin Mark, who just happened to work at the local office of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. I didn't tell Karen any of this. I just waited. 3 days later, it happened again. I was at work. Theo was inside, home with my sister who was visiting for the week. Karen showed up midday. I watched the footage that night over dinner. She marched straight up to the ramp, grabbed the side handle, and started yanking it off the porch again. Theo opened the door and shouted, "Stop that!" Karen turned, red-faced, and screamed, "This thing is illegal. If you don't want it broken, keep it off the property." She gave it a violent kick before storming off. Theo's voice was trembling on the video. "Why are you so mean?" I uploaded the footage and emailed it directly to the Dodge's ADA compliance office. Mark forwarded it to their legal team and said he'd pull some strings. The next morning, I walked into the HOA office and dropped a printed letter on Karen's desk. "What's this?" she snapped. "Notice of federal investigation for ADA violations," I said, already walking away. "Have fun." She didn't laugh that time. 2 days later, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. Of course, it wasn't open to residents, but that didn't stop me from standing outside with a few neighbors I'd been talking to lately. Turns out, Karen had ticked off more than just me. One guy said she tried to fine his daughter for chalk drawings on their driveway. Another woman said Karen threatened to call animal control on her therapy dog. We had ourselves a little support group brewing. When the meeting ended, Karen stormed out looking like she'd swallowed a lemon. She didn't say a word to any of us. The next morning, I got a letter, this time from the HOA's attorney. It was a formal apology. They were reviewing their policies for ADA compliance and would cease further enforcement actions regarding the ramp. But that wasn't enough for me. I sent the footage, the fine notices, and a timeline of every interaction to the DOJ attorney Mark connected me with. And I filed a formal complaint with the Fair Housing Office while I was at it. The real fun started when the feds showed up unannounced the following week, clipboards in hand, walking door to door asking residents about ADA violations, harassment, and HOA conduct. Karen didn't come out of her house that day. The sight of federal agents walking door to door in our neighborhood had a peculiar effect: silence. The kind that hummed behind drawn curtains and twitching blinds. No barking dogs, no lawnmowers, no chatty joggers. Just the slow, deliberate steps of investigators asking questions that made people shift uncomfortably on their porches. For the first time since moving in, I felt the weight shift. Something had cracked, but I knew better than to think it was over. Karen wasn't the type to fold just because someone told her she was wrong. She'd dig in deeper, and if she couldn't win by force, she'd try to win with paperwork and whispers. The next clue came in the form of a neon orange violation notice taped to my front window. Not the ramp this time. Now it was unauthorized security surveillance. They were trying to hit me for the camera I'd installed, claiming it infringed on neighbor privacy. It was laughable. The camera was angled only at my own porch and driveway, which I made sure to document with a screenshot and a notarized statement. Still, I knew what this was: retaliation. A new strategy. If they couldn't bully me over the ramp, they'd try to wear me down with petty nonsense. I didn't bother responding to the notice. Instead, I sent it straight to the DOJ contact, who was already compiling evidence of pattern harassment. That same week, I received a formal letter from a civil rights attorney offering pro bono representation. Word had apparently spread beyond just our neighborhood. Meanwhile, a strange tension gripped Oak Hill Bluffs. The usual HOA meetings were postponed indefinitely, and Karen was notably absent from her usual patrols. But her absence didn't mean her influence had vanished. On a quiet Thursday evening, I caught movement in my backyard. I stepped outside and found two teenagers crouched near the shed. They bolted the instant they saw me, but not before I noticed the shirts matching light blue polos with the HOA logo screen printed across the back. The next morning, my backyard motion lights were shattered. One of my tires had been knifed. I filed a police report immediately. The officer who came out, a tall guy named Patel, frowned as he examined the damage. "You said your son's disabled?" he asked, crouching near the tire. "Yeah, wheelchair-bound since birth." "Why?" "There's a pattern of escalating harassment here," he said. "Normally, we'd treat this as vandalism, but given the context, I'll elevate this, especially if there's any risk to your kid's safety." I gave him the footage from the previous night, fuzzy but clear enough to make out the shirts. That did it. Within a few days, 2 officers visited the HOA office with a warrant in hand. I didn't see it firsthand, but my neighbor, Mr. Choi, called me that afternoon. "They're hauling out boxes," he said. "From that little office. Binders, folders, even a hard drive." "You did something, didn't you?" I didn't respond. I just stared out at the street while an unmarked car idled outside the HOA's converted garage. By the end of the week, subpoenas were issued. Turns out, Karen had been running a shadow file system off the book's records she used to track problem households. She'd been collecting personal data, including medical notes, without consent. Even worse, a digital audit revealed she'd falsified multiple violation reports by backdating timestamps and editing images. That's when the dominoes really started to fall. A group of residents, led by a retired real estate attorney named Linda Trammell, drafted a motion to recall Karen from her position. They needed 40 signatures. They got 62. The petition was delivered via certified mail, along with a formal cease and desist over her unauthorized surveillance of residents. But Karen didn't just retreat. She doubled down with one last, desperate act. On a Sunday afternoon, Theo and I returned from grocery shopping to find the ramp completely gone. Not damaged, not moved, gone. Someone had unbolted it and taken it. Theo stared at the empty porch edge, then looked up at me with wide, confused eyes. I called the police again. Officer Patel showed up once more, this time with a partner. I gave them the footage from the doorbell camera. This time, it was clear two men, both wearing HOA polos, removing the ramp and loading it into the back of a community maintenance truck. They didn't even bother hiding it. Patel shook his head. This isn't just tampering anymore. That ramp's classified as medical equipment. This is theft of ADA-mandated property. That's a felony. I filed charges immediately. The two men were identified as temporary hires Karen had brought on for property compliance reinforcement. Neither had background checks. One had a prior assault charge. The maintenance truck, registered to the HOA, paid for with community dues. That was the final nail. The DOJ filed a formal federal lawsuit on behalf of Theo, citing multiple violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, harassment, and discriminatory enforcement. The Fair Housing Office joined in. The State Attorney General's office opened an inquiry into misuse of HOA funds. Karen was served at her home. I heard about it from Linda, who watched from her driveway as Karen tried to argue with the agents. She was apparently screaming something about preserving standards and entitled children before slamming the door in their faces. At the next public meeting, the first in over a month, Karen didn't show. Instead, the interim board members, including Linda, stood before a packed clubhouse and made a formal statement. "We are aware of the misconduct that has occurred under previous leadership," Linda said firmly. Effective immediately, all enforcement actions issued under Karen Stokely's presidency are suspended pending audit. Furthermore, any resident who experienced harassment is encouraged to speak with our legal liaison. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. As I stood in the back with Theo beside me, people turned. They nodded. A few even clapped quietly. Later that week, I received a check from the HOA's insurance provider. Full reimbursement for the stolen ramp, plus damages. A second letter arrived the next day from the Department of Justice, confirming that Karen had been fined over $70,000 for ADA violations, with a portion of that restitution earmarked for Theo's future medical needs. Neighbors started coming by not just to apologize, but to offer help. One guy, a contractor, offered to build a permanent ramp with weatherproof railings free of charge. When it was finished, Theo rolled down it with a grin, holding a little toy flag he planted at the bottom. "This is mine now," he said. I nodded. "Yeah, buddy, it's yours." Karen eventually moved out. No one saw her go. Her house went on the market quietly, then sold to a young couple with a golden retriever and a box of sidewalk chalk in the garage. The ramp stayed. The camera stayed. And the new board rewrote the HOA's enforcement policy from scratch, this time with a civil rights attorney reviewing every line. The neighborhood changed after that. Not overnight, but steadily. People waved more. Kids played outside. And if anyone ever tried to complain about a ramp again, they were met with a wall of solidarity. As for Theo, he started drawing pictures on the ramp itself, little stars and rockets and dragons in bright chalk colors. Every time I looked at it, I saw not just a slope of metal and paint, but a line in the sand. And Karen. Last I heard, she was facing civil litigation from 3 other families, the kind of lawsuits that don't just sting, they echo. 3 weeks after the ramp was rebuilt, this time in solid cedar with reinforced aluminum rails, and a custom plaque that read Theo's Launch Pad, the neighborhood was still buzzing. The board had been gutted, the bylaws rewritten, and the federal investigation had triggered a statewide review of HOA practices. But something still didn't sit right. The deeper I looked, the more I realized Karen hadn't just been a tyrant with a clipboard. She had been running something more organized, more deliberate. It wasn't just about rules, it was about control, and some of it looked criminal. Linda met me on my front porch one evening after the sun dipped below the pines that lined the cul-de-sac. She had a thick folder in her hands and a crease between her eyebrows that hadn't been there before. "I got these from a whistleblower," she said without sitting down, "a former board secretary who moved out last year. Said she kept copies of everything in case something like this ever came to light." I opened the folder and started flipping through page after page of spreadsheets, emails, and signed bank statements. One column stood out: Neighborhood Improvement Fund Discretionary Use. It was a slush fund. Nearly $50,000 had been siphoned over the last 3 years without any documentation of where it went. Linda pointed to one entry. "Look at the date. That's the same week Karen had the community garden bulldozed. And this one. That's when she told everyone the pool needed emergency repairs, but never produced an invoice." I leaned against the railing, heart thudding. "You think she was embezzling? I think we're past thinking. I filed a complaint with the county auditor, but there's more. Look at this." She handed me a printed email thread between Karen and someone named Russell W. The subject line read, "Selective Enforcement Strategy." The body of the message detailed a plan to target specific residents deemed non-conforming liabilities, most of whom, I noticed, had either children with disabilities, non-traditional family structures, or were people of color. My hands went cold. She was profiling. Linda nodded. "And building cases against them to force them out. This isn't just about fines anymore. She was manipulating property values to benefit a handful of insiders. I think she was flipping homes." That changed everything. I called Mark again, this time not just as a contact, but as someone I needed to bring in fully. He worked fast, coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Within days, subpoenas were issued for access to HOA financials and emails. A forensic accountant was assigned, and the entire paper trail started unraveling. Then came the next shock. A neighbor, Jamal, quiet guy, ex-Marine, lived 4 doors down, came forward with something explosive. He invited me and Linda over one evening and opened a locked cabinet in his garage. Inside was a stack of old DVR tapes from his exterior security system. He pointed to one. "This is from last year, July, the night after my wife's car got keyed and the mailboxes were smashed. HOA told us it was kids. But I saved everything." On the screen, grainy footage showed 2 men in HOA polos walking down the street after midnight. One of them stopped at Jamal's mailbox and struck it with what looked like a crowbar. The other sprayed something on the front gate of his home, red paint spelling "Move." Linda's hand went to her mouth. "They were staging damage." Jamal nodded. "Trying to scare us out, we reported it. Karen said nothing could be done without proof." We handed the tape to the DOJ team. Things escalated quickly after that. A week later, federal agents executed a search warrant on Karen's home. Neighbors watched as boxes of files, hard drives, and even a desktop tower were carried out. The arrest came quietly, no sirens, no cuffs in the street. But the next morning, a notice appeared taped to her mailbox. "This property is under federal investigation." The charges were serious: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice. And that was just the beginning. The local DA tacked on charges of embezzlement and criminal mischief, after investigators found receipts for equipment used to damage neighborhood property purchased under the HOA's maintenance budget. The crowbar from Jamal's video. Found in her garage, still tagged with an inventory sticker from the HOA supply shed, Theo watched all of this unfold without really understanding the depth of it. But he knew enough to feel safe again. He slept through the night. He started inviting kids over to build Lego cities in the garage. The cloud had lifted. One afternoon, while I was patching a hole in the backyard fence, a woman I'd never seen before approached. She wore a county badge around her neck and introduced herself as Rachel from the office of the Inspector General. "I wanted to thank you," she said, adjusting the strap on her tablet case. "Your documentation and persistence opened the door for something bigger. We've identified at least 6 other communities in the county where similar abuses were happening. Same structure. Same tactics." I set down the hammer. "Karen was part of something bigger," Rachel nodded. "We think she was trained by a private management firm that teaches boards how to optimize compliance, which is code for targeting vulnerable residents and flipping homes for profit. We're building a racketeering case now." That night, I sat on the porch with Theo as fireflies blinked across the yard. He looked up. "Is the mean lady coming back?" I shook my head. "She's gone, and she's not coming back." He thought about that for a moment, then pointed to the ramp. "Can we paint it again? Any color you want," I said. We chose bright orange this time. Theo called it Dragon Fire. Neighbors stopped by and added their own touches: stars, rainbows, even a tiny spaceship. It became more than a ramp. It was a monument to what we'd endured and what we'd stopped. The new board, now chaired by Linda, held its first fully transparent meeting on the community lawn under string lights and a rented tent. Every expenditure was read aloud. Every vote was recorded. And this time, residents weren't just allowed to speak, they were encouraged to. During the open mic, I stood up. I hadn't planned to. I hate public speaking. But I looked at Theo, then at the crowd that had become something more than neighbors. "I didn't move here to fight a battle," I said, voice steady. "But when someone threatens your family, you fight. We didn't just stop a bully. We exposed a system. And now we're building something better." Applause broke out, not loud or forced, just pure, quiet respect. I sat down and Theo squeezed my hand. Weeks later, I got a letter in the mail from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Karen had taken a plea deal. She was facing up to 5 years behind bars, and part of her agreement included a permanent ban from holding any position of authority in a housing or neighborhood association. The restitution fund created from the seized HOA accounts would go toward rebuilding the community garden, upgrading the playground, and creating an emergency assistance fund for vulnerable residents. And just like that, the power she once clutched so tightly dissolved into something real: accountability. We didn't just win. We changed the rules. The first real rain of the season came down hard, soaking the neighborhood in a kind of baptism. The scent of clean pavement mixed with fresh cedar drifted from the ramp, now lined with small solar lights that glowed like fireflies in the gray dusk. The chaos that had gripped Oak Hill Bluffs for so long felt like it had finally washed away, maybe, but I knew better. Buried things always had a way of surfacing. I was sitting on the porch with a mug of coffee gone cold when Linda pulled up in her station wagon. She didn't get out right away. Instead, she sat in the driver's seat, staring at the folder in her lap. I walked over, tapped the glass, and she rolled it down. "They're going after the management firm," she said without preamble. Her voice was tight, unsteady. "The same one that trained Karen. The same one that's operating in over 50 other communities across the state." I leaned against the open window. "How bad?" "They were coaching board members on how to reshape demographics. That's the term they used. There's written documentation, PowerPoint slides, even training videos. It's all being reviewed by the state attorney general and the DOJ. She handed me a flash drive in a sealed evidence bag. "I wasn't supposed to have this, but Rachel wanted you to see it. You're the reason any of this is happening." I didn't ask what was on it. I already had a feeling it would be worse than anything we'd uncovered so far. That night, after Theo went to bed, I plugged the drive into my laptop. the screen filled with folders labeled Compliance Tactics, Asset Recovery, and Demographic Optimization. I clicked one at random and watched a training module titled Encouraging Voluntary Departures. A narrator's voice explained how to subtly pressure non-conforming residents to sell through persistent violations, social isolation, and property devaluation. Then came the playback of a mock HOA meeting where an actor playing the board president suggested limiting accessibility features to preserve neighborhood image. Everyone nodded and clapped. I had to stop the video halfway through. The next morning, I met with Rachel at a quiet diner outside city limits. She was already seated, sipping tea and watching the door. She slid a sealed envelope toward me. That drive is part of a sealed federal investigation now. The firm is implicated in a multi-state scheme targeting vulnerable residents for forced turnover. Karen may have been a pawn, but she played her role with enthusiasm. I opened the envelope. Inside was a copy of a sworn affidavit from a former employee of the management firm. She had worked in the legal compliance division and had supplied the DOJ with internal memos that instructed HOA boards on how to strategically neutralize residents with protected statuses without triggering lawsuits. They knew what they were doing was illegal, I said. Rachel nodded. And they did it anyway for profit. They built a system that rewarded discrimination under the guise of uniformity. Karen just happened to be the poster child for their methods. Later that week, the indictments came down, not just for Karen, not just for the two goons who stole the ramp, but for 7 executives from the management firm, including the CEO and the director of compliance. Charges included conspiracy to violate civil rights, mail fraud, racketeering, and obstruction of justice. The news broke fast. Local papers ran front-page stories. National outlets picked it up by the weekend. Suburban scandal exposes HOA corruption ring. Suddenly, Oak Hill Bluffs wasn't just a neighborhood, it was the epicenter of a national reckoning. A week after the indictments, I was invited to a press conference held at the city council chamber. I hadn't planned to speak, just observe. But when the mayor stepped up to the podium and began describing the investigation as the result of one resident's courage to stand against systemic abuse, I realized they were talking about me. The mayor turned toward the crowd. "Silas Warren, would you join us up here?" I hesitated, but the applause started before I could say no. I walked up, heart pounding, and took the mic. "I didn't do this for any recognition," I said, voice even. "I did it because someone threatened my son. And when you threaten a child, especially one who's already fighting harder than most to live a normal life, you better expect a fight back. What we uncovered here isn't just about bad rules or power-hungry board members. It's about a system that profits from silence. And I'm proud to say we didn't stay silent." Another round of applause followed, but I barely heard it. I was already thinking about what came next. Back in the neighborhood, things continued to shift. The HOA board, now fully reconstructed and operating with oversight from a third-party compliance monitor, held a community day to rebuild trust. Residents painted murals on the community center walls. Kids raced down the sidewalks with chalk-streaked hands. Someone even brought a barbecue smoker and served pulled pork sandwiches in the rain. Theo insisted on painting his own mural, a giant phoenix rising from flames, with the words "We stayed" in big, messy letters underneath. No one dared touch it afterward. It became the centerpiece of the community center, a symbol of what we'd endured and what we'd rebuilt. A few weeks later, I received a call from a civil rights attorney named Dana out of Washington, D.C. She was heading up a class action suit against the management firm and asked if I would be willing to serve as a lead plaintiff. "We believe your case represents the clearest instance of systematic abuse," she said. "And we think you'd be a powerful voice for others who haven't found the courage to speak yet." I agreed, not because I wanted to keep fighting, but because I knew there were still people out there who needed someone to stand for them. People like the single mother in the next town over, whose HOA told her to remove her daughter's therapy swing. Or the elderly veteran whose ramp was declared a non-conforming structure and torn down while he was hospitalized. The class action suit moved quickly. With the Dodge's documentation and the whistleblower testimony, the firm settled out of court for over $18 million. A portion of that was allocated to a federal grant program to educate and train HOA boards on civil rights compliance. Another portion went directly to the affected families. Theo and I didn't take a payout. Instead, we asked that our share be donated to a nonprofit that builds accessibility ramps for low-income families. They named the fund after him, Theo's Way. One evening, long after the lawsuits and the headlines faded, I sat under the stars with Theo curled up beside me and a radio humming soft jazz from the garage. He looked up at me, his voice sleepy. Did we win? I thought about that. Not just the fines or the arrests or the reforms. I thought about the neighbors who now looked out for each other. The board that now answered to the residents, not the other way around. The kids drawing dragons on sidewalks without fear of reprimand. Yeah, I said finally. We did. He smiled and drifted off, his hand resting on my arm. The ramp glowed in the dark, lit by the solar lights, dry now after the rain. And for the first time in a long while, everything felt still. Not because trouble was gone for good, but because we'd proven we could face it and beat it when it came, and if it ever showed up again, we'd be ready.